All right. Okay, after her Bachelor of Arts, Naomi completed her Master's of Public Health at the City University of New York in 2015 in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And her thesis focused on rat activity around New York City public schools in response to a pilot study on the collection of organics. During her program, she worked as a research assistant with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And after she graduated, Naomi got a job as an applied epidemiology fellow with the New Mexico Department of Health. So Naomi started the doctoral program here in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the fall of 2017. She has had an outstanding academic record for her classes, and she received honors on her departmental comprehensive exam. Since 2018, she has held an NCI predoctoral fellowship in cancer epidemiology, prevention, and control. At the 2019 American Public Health Association conference, Naomi's work on breast cancer health disparities won the Walter J. Lear Award for Best Student Abstract. And a well-known health disparities researcher who was on the panel commended Naomi for her research and oral presentation. And you will soon see that Naomi is an excellent presenter. Naomi demonstrates academic and personal excellence in all of her work. Each summer since arriving at Hopkins, she has provided advice and mentorship to underrepresented minority students in the School of Public Health's diversity summer internship program. She has served as chair of the School of Public Health's Forum on Alcohol Research and Advocacy. She has represented student voices on the Health, Behavior, and Society Research Affairs Committee, and she's advocated for all doctoral students as the secretary of the School of Public Health's Doctoral Student Council, and this past year as co-chair of the Doctoral Student Council. So in addition to her research and service, Naomi has contributed to teaching efforts. I've been very lucky to have Naomi as a member of the teaching team for my second term course, and she has also guest lectured in an undergraduate and a graduate course. Now, Naomi is poised to complete her doctoral program in 3.5 years. She already has 5 peer-reviewed papers, including 4 as first author. During her program, in addition to working as a student researcher with Dr. Lori Dean in the Department of Epidemiology, Naomi has also worked as a data analyst for the Alcohol Subcommittee of the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists. And she was a CDC alcohol fellow with our Center on Alcohol Marketing and Youth. I'm so glad to see David Jernigan here, who was Naomi's first advisor. Naomi's first dissertation paper has received a revise and resubmit from a journal, and it has been resubmitted. It's undergoing review. Her second dissertation paper is also under review at a journal, and her third paper is very close to being submitted. Naomi will begin a postdoc in the new year with the NIH National Institutes of Health NIDA Drug Dependence Epidemiology Training Program. And in June, she'll begin a National Institutes of Health National Cancer Institute Cancer Prevention Fellowship. So it's my distinct pleasure to now hand it over to Naomi Greene to tell you about her dissertation research. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Okay. So please give me a nod if you can, or a thumbs up if you can see this. Great. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Naomi Greene, and today I'm going to be sharing my dissertation research that looks at disparities in binge drinking across sexual identity and attempts to understand the role of the alcohol policy environment and non-discrimination statutes. This is our outline for today. I'll begin with a little bit of background on the knowledge gaps in the research, also discuss the research question and aims, talk about the methods and data sources that were used to answer this research question, discuss just some of the key findings of the research, and I'll end by talking about the strengths and limitations of this research project, the policy and practice implications, and we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. I want to begin with a couple of definitions just to orient everyone. And so I want to talk about the difference between sexual orientation versus gender identity, given some of the terms I'm going to be using during the presentation. So sexual orientation is more about how people relate to others. And so you can see here a definition from the Institute of Medicine that describes sexual orientation as this enduring pattern to experience sexual or romantic desires for either people of the same sex, a different sex, another sex, or no sex at all. And this is a multifaceted construct that includes identity, attraction, and behavior. On the other hand, gender identity is more of an internal sense of who a person is. It's your deeply felt sense of whether you're a man, a woman, both a man or a woman, or another gender. And today we're going to be talking about disparities across sexual orientation, specifically sexual identity in binge drinking. I want to also convince you, if you're not convinced already, that excessive alcohol use is a public health issue. And I'm going to do that by presenting a few different numbers. So the first number is 88,000. This is how many deaths every year in the United States are attributable to alcohol. The second number is 223.5 billion. This is what alcohol cost us in the United States. And these are just some of the costs. And this includes healthcare costs, lost productivity, as well as things like criminal justice costs. And I think most importantly, what makes excessive alcohol use a public health problem is that the overwhelming majority of people who drink excessively in our society are not alcohol dependent. So, alcohol dependence is when an individual has difficulty stopping alcohol use, even if they want to. They may experience withdrawal symptoms and they really do need to get substance use treatment. But most people don't fall in this category. And that's why we need public health solutions to deal with excessive alcohol use as a public health problem. Binge drinking is one particular form of excessive alcohol use. This is the definition from the National Institutes of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. So it's defined as 4 or more drinks for women, 5 or more drinks for men in about a 2-hour period. On average, this raises a person's blood alcohol level to the legal limit in most states. And the reason that this pattern of drinking is really problematic is that it's responsible for several acute issues, including things like motor vehicle crashes and fatalities, injuries, as well as interpersonal violence. And there is a very long history of literature looking at what we can do to reduce excessive alcohol use in the population. And one thing that we come back to over and over again is alcohol policy. So the definition of alcohol policy is that this includes all the laws, the regulations, in some cases practices that we use to reduce excessive alcohol consumption and related harms in society. And we know from the literature that individual alcohol policies, for example, alcohol taxes, are associated with reductions in individual level as well as population level binge drinking. But where the literature is starting to go is to look at alcohol policy environments and alcohol use. And what do I mean by alcohol policy environments? Well, when we implement or we enact an individual alcohol policy, we don't do that in a vacuum. There are other policies that impact alcohol use that have also been implemented or enacted in a jurisdiction. So when we talk about the alcohol policy environment, we're talking about the combined strength of multiple individual alcohol policies that are functioning within a jurisdiction. And one of the things we know from the literature is that stronger alcohol policy environments are associated with lower binge drinking. But we also know that there are pretty serious disparities in alcohol use, particularly binge drinking across sexual identity. So, compared with heterosexual adults, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or LGB adults have a much higher prevalence of binge drinking. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration estimates it's 36% among LGB adults versus 27% among heterosexual adults. Lesbian and bisexual and other sexual minority women are much more likely to engage in high intensity binge drinking, which is defined as having 8 or more drinks in that 2 hour period. And LGB adults are much more likely to experience negative consequences as a result of their drinking. And one of those negative consequences is alcohol dependence. There is greater odds in terms of alcohol dependence among LGB adults. And the literature that attempts to understand what causes these disparities is really focused on the experiences of discrimination and minority stress that individuals experience. But we know in public health that an individual's behavior does not just come from their individual knowledge or attitudes or the relationships that we have with others. We know that individuals live within communities and there might be social norms within those communities as well as policies. And from the literature, what we know is that worse mental health outcomes, for example, are associated with more discriminatory legislation. So, for example, bans on same sex marriage, lack of employment protections, or discrimination in public accommodations. Whereas, on the other hand, when we have inclusive state laws, those have been associated with lower mental health expenditures, lower depressive symptoms among LGB adults, and lower adverse drinking consequences. But we don't know a lot about how state laws impact binge drinking among LGB populations or how they impact disparities. And so I want to talk a little bit about the knowledge gaps in these two different literatures. One is the alcohol policy literature, and the other is the LGB health literature. And I would say that the first gap actually is that these are not literatures that are actually talking to each other. In the alcohol policy literature, there's often a focus on the population as a whole with some limited examination of subgroups. And so far, there's been very little examination of the impact of alcohol policies on drinking patterns among LGB subgroups. On the other hand, in the LGB health literature, a lot of the studies trying to understand and unpack disparities between LGB and heterosexual adults focus on whether or not someone has actually experienced discrimination or prejudice. There's also a focus on mental health and substance use disorders, even when those studies are looking at policies. And there's really been no examination of policy and binge drinking within this literature. And so, what I'd like to talk about is how my research is oriented or the theoretical foundations for this research based on these two literatures. And the first is what I'm referring to as the basic economic view. So, in this view, people behave rationally, and alcohol policy impacts how affordable, how accessible, and how available alcohol is. And in some sense, it increases the cost. And that can be very literally in terms of how much you pay for alcohol, or it can also increase the social cost. So, for example, the civil and criminal penalties that you might experience for using alcohol in inappropriate ways. On the other hand, my research is also grounded in structural stigma. And so my research actually pivots a little bit away from minority stress theory, which is often the theory that grounds a lot of research on LGB health disparities, to structural stigma, which is a theoretical framework by Lincoln Phelan that focuses on these macro level factors that reinforce power differentials between privileged and non privileged groups. And within this theoretical foundation, binge drinking could be viewed as a maladaptive coping behavior to living in an environment that stigmatizes you based on your identity. So, with those knowledge gaps and that theoretical foundation, I pose the following research question: how do state level alcohol policy environments interact with non discrimination laws to contribute to binge drinking disparities between LGB adults and heterosexual adults in the United States? To answer this question, I created three aims. The first aim is to examine just the association between state level alcohol policy environments and differences in binge drinking across sexual identity. The second aim was then to look at those inclusive non discrimination laws, and I'll explain a bit more about what I mean by inclusive in a bit, and binge drinking disparities across sexual identity. And the third aim was to look at these two types of policies in tandem and how they perhaps work together to influence binge drinking disparities across sexual identity. So let me break this down a little bit more based on my conceptual framework. So, what we already know is that binge drinking is associated with negative alcohol related health outcomes. We also know that the alcohol policy environment is associated with lowering or reducing binge drinking, individual level binge drinking, and population level binge drinking. But what we don't know is whether or not that relationship looks different based on an individual's sexual identity. And that is the purpose of AIM 1 in this research. The second aim is to look at the impact of non discrimination law on binge drinking. So we know that public policies and state laws have an impact on LGB health, but we don't know very much about non discrimination law on binge drinking. And again, we don't know whether or not this relationship differs based on an individual's sexual identity. And that's the second aim of this research. And then after looking at both of these relationships separately, the third aim of the research is to look at them together and also to ask whether or not these relationships and the way that they work together differs by sexual identity. And that's aim 3 of the research. So I'll move on and talk about the methods and data sources used for these analyses. The first data source is the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. This is a cross sectional survey that's overseen by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, but it's actually implemented in each individual state. The years of data that I'm using for this analysis are 2015 through 2018, with a sample size of a little over 900,000. The BRFSS uses randomized multi-stage sampling and includes landline and cell phone numbers so that we can get a representative sample of the population, and includes participants that are 18 years and older. Part of the reason for using this particular sample is that it includes an alcohol consumption module, which measures past 30-day use for a variety of alcohol use patterns, including binge drinking as defined by NIAAA. So, again, that's 4+ drinks for women, 5+ drinks for men on one occasion. And that's the main outcome of all of these analyses. And the BRFSS also collects information on sexual identity through the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity module, also referred to as the SOGI module. And it asks the question: do you consider yourself to be straight, lesbian, or gay, bisexual, or something else? The Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity module is optional for states to use. And during this time period, only 35 states used the module. I'll talk a little bit about the main exposures for this analysis, which are the alcohol policy environment and inclusive non discrimination laws. The alcohol policy environment is measured using something called the Alcohol Policy Scale Score. So, this was developed and calculated by colleagues at Boston University using a variety of input data sources. And essentially, it measures the combined strength of all the alcohol policies that have been enacted at the state level within a state within a given year. A higher alcohol policy score is synonymous with having a stronger alcohol policy environment where alcohol, again, is less available, less affordable, less accessible, or the civil and criminal penalties for violating those laws are more severe. And this is treated as a continuous variable in the analyses. The other main exposure is inclusive non-discrimination law. And what I mean by inclusive non-discrimination law is that the words sexual orientation are explicitly within non-discrimination state laws. And for to get this information, I went to the Movement Advancement Project as well as the Human Rights Campaign. The Movement Advancement Project is a think tank that surveils state and also local policies to look for policies in terms of how they impact LGBT equality. And then the Human Rights Campaign is actually an advocacy organization that has a legal arm that does very similar work. And because neither one of these organizations is sort of the legal authority, I did some triangulation, and they are in 100% agreement. And I also did look at a handful of states' individual laws to ensure that sexual orientation was or was not included. I was interested in laws around employment, housing, and public accommodations. It turns out that for the states included in this analysis for the time period, if the state had an inclusive employment non discrimination law, again, their law explicitly included protections on the basis of sexual orientation. This was also the case for their housing laws as well as their public accommodation laws. So this has been treated as one binary variable for whether the state has inclusive laws that include sexual orientation as a protected class or whether they don't. I want to talk a little bit about the covariates that were included in this analysis to adjust for confounding and their various data sources. So, from the American Community Survey as well as the 2010 census, there's a variety of demographic variables at the population level that I adjusted for. From the Williams Institute, I was able to get an estimate of the percentage of lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults living in the state. And I think of this as a proxy for a person's ability to find LGBT community within their state. From the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting System, I got a variable on law enforcement officers per capita. This has been adjusted for in other studies that use the alcohol policy scale score, and it's meant to be a proxy for a state's ability to enforce the alcohol laws on their books. And then from the US religious census, or I should say US religion census, I got a measure of the Catholics per 100,000 population. This is also a covariate that's been included in previous studies. And part of the reason for that is that there was some early work done. There was some work done in the early 2000s looking at religious affiliation and binge drinking across the country. And where there are a greater prevalence of Catholics, there just so happens, this is ecological data, there does happen to be higher binge drinking prevalence. And then I included a variety of individual characteristics that come from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. I'll talk a little bit about the statistical methods. I first started with an exploratory data analysis because the sexual orientation and gender identity module is optional. So it's not in all 50 states. And what I found is that the use of the module is actually not associated with binge drinking prevalence. It's not associated with the alcohol policy environment. And the use of the module is also surprisingly not associated with whether or not a state has inclusive non discrimination laws. For the primary data analysis, all the aims use the same statistical methods, which is logistic regression, because the outcome in binge drinking is binary. It accounts for the complex survey design. All models have been stratified by sex because the epidemiology of binge drinking is different for men and women. And I used interaction terms in my models to assess whether or not these associations are different by sexual identity. What I'm going to present in the findings, however, are the stratified models. And the findings that I present today will just be among women, as most of these associations were not statistically significant for men. But I do have those data if you're interested in looking at them. So again, I would like to remind you what the aim one is. So that's looking at the association between state level alcohol policy environments and binge drinking across sexual identity. Because this aim is grounded in what I'm referring to as the basic economic view, my hypothesis is that the association should be the same, as there's no reason to believe that they should be different. And there was actually support for this hypothesis among women. So what you see here is the association between the alcohol policy score, sexual identity, and individual level binge drinking among women, adjusted for all of the covariates that I discussed earlier. And what you can see is that a 10 percentage point increase in the alcohol policy scale score is associated with 0.96 times the odds of binge drinking. So, what that means is that stronger alcohol policy environments are associated with lower binge drinking odds among women. However, you can also see that among lesbian and bisexual women, in comparison to heterosexual women, there are higher odds of binge drinking. So among lesbian women, the odds of binge drinking are 1.43 times the odds of heterosexual women. And the odds of binge drinking among bisexual women in comparison to heterosexual women is about 1.58 times the odds. And those are statistically significant findings. So despite accounting for the strength of the alcohol policy environment and a variety of other factors, lesbian and bisexual women still have higher odds of binge drinking. I'll move on and discuss AIM 2. And just to remind you what AIM 2 is, it's looking at inclusive state level non discrimination laws and binge and their association with binge drinking across sexual identity. This aim is grounded in the theory of structural stigma. And so, in that sense, I hypothesize that there would be a difference. So, lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals living in states that have inclusive non discrimination laws, in theory, are living in places with less structural stigma. And so the disparity between LGBT adults and heterosexual adults, I'm hypothesizing, would be smaller than in states that don't have these inclusive non discrimination laws. And among women, there is support for this hypothesis, and I'll present the stratified tables for this. So here we have the association between identity and binge drinking stratified by whether or not states have inclusive statutes. And this is just among women. So there are about 19 states in these analyses that had inclusive laws. And what you can see is that the odds of binge drinking among lesbian women is 1.71 times the odds of binge drinking among heterosexual women. For bisexual women, the odds of binge drinking is about 1.83 times the odds of binge drinking for heterosexual women, again, adjusted for a variety of state and individual level factors. And so we can see that in these types of states, lesbian and bisexual women have significantly higher odds of binge drinking compared with heterosexual women. However, when we look at states with inclusive laws, and there are about 16 of these states in the analysis, we see a different story. So there's no significant difference in the odds of binge drinking between lesbian and heterosexual women. So even though the odds ratio is 1.19, we see that there's one in that 95% confidence interval, suggesting that this is not a statistically significant difference. However, we do see slightly elevated odds of binge drinking among bisexual women. So, in comparison to heterosexual women, bisexual women have 1.35 times the odds of binge drinking in states with inclusive statutes, but this is still a lower difference than what we see in states without inclusive statutes. I'll move on and talk about my third aim and the findings for that. And again, to remind you of what this is looking at the intersection between state level alcohol policy environments and non discrimination laws and how they work together potentially to influence binge drinking disparities across sexual identity. So, this aim is really grounded in both what I'm referring to as the basic economic view as well as structural stigma. And so, I hypothesize that in states that have inclusive statutes that might modify the association between alcohol policy environments and binge drinking disparities. So we would see a difference based on whether or not states had inclusive non-discrimination laws. And again, there is some support for this hypothesis among women. And again, I'll present the stratified models. So here we have the association between alcohol policy score and sexual identity and binge drinking. in states without inclusive laws. And you can see that there's no association between the APS score and the odds of binge drinking. So the odds ratio is 0.98, but the confidence intervals include one, suggesting that this is not a significantly lower odds ratio. And again, we see a higher odds of binge drinking among lesbian and bisexual women in inclusive laws. But the story is different when we look at states with inclusive laws. So in these states, a 10 percentage point increase in the APS score is associated with 0.93 odds of binge drinking, so lower odds of binge drinking as the alcohol policy environment gets stronger. We see there's no significant difference in the odds of binge drinking between lesbian and heterosexual women. Again, the 95% confidence interval includes one, suggesting no significant difference. And yes, we do see a slightly elevated odds of binge drinking comparing bisexual women to heterosexual women. But again, this is a much lower odds ratio than what we see in states without inclusive statutes, which has led me to conclude that in states with inclusive statutes, we see that stronger alcohol policy environments are associated with lower odds of binge drinking, and we see no significant difference in binge drinking odds between lesbian and heterosexual women. So I want to move on to the discussion, discuss the strengths, limitations, and finish with some policy and practice implications of this research. And I'll begin by summarizing the findings from each one of these aims. So for aim one, what I found was that alcohol policy environments don't widen binge drinking disparities between LGBT women and heterosexual women, but they also don't seem to reduce the disparity or narrow the disparity either. In the second aim, we found that inclusive non-discrimination laws do actually narrow binge drinking disparities between lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual women. And in aim three, I found that inclusive non-discrimination laws do modify the association between alcohol policy environments, and they work together to reduce binge drinking among women, but not necessarily men. There are a number of limitations that we need to keep in mind in looking at these data. One is that this is cross-sectional data, so association is not causation. There is massive underestimation of binge drinking in survey data. By one study's account, the BRFSS only accounts for about 22 to 32% of drinking in states. Local alcohol policies are not included in the APS score, so the degree to which local alcohol policies may be influencing the strength of the alcohol policy environment is not captured. And as I've said earlier, sexual identity is not collected in all 50 states. And so we can't make inferences from the data that are included in these analyses to all 50 states, though we can make inferences to those states that were included in the analyses because of the way that individuals are sampled. The BRFSS only asks about sexual identity, and as I alluded to earlier, sexual orientation is a multifaceted construct that includes identity, attraction, and behavior. And these associations might look very different if we accounted for the intersections of identity, attraction, and behavior. And it's possible within government surveys that we're undercounting sexual minority populations. There was a very small study done among gay, bisexual, and other sexual minority men, of whom 30% said that they would be uncomfortable telling their sexual identity on a government survey. And there's also the potential issue for the measurement of sex and gender. Up until very recently, sex on the BRFSS was often determined by tone of voice by the interviewer. And recently in 2018, CDC provided two methods for states to use to capture sex. One question asks about sex at birth, and one question just asks about sex. And so there could be some misclassification that happens or measurement error that happens as the result of how we've been measuring sex and gender in the BRFSS over time. Despite those limitations, I think that there are quite a few strengths to this research as well. The first is that it's really grounded in social theory and grounded in the literature. So grounded in this basic economic view and grounded in the theory of structural stigma. It bridges these two disparate academic literatures that really have not been talking to each other to fill really important gaps. So for the alcohol policy literature, it's really important to bring this health equity perspective when we enact laws and we evaluate them and their impact on population health. We really have to know whether or not they have a differential impact on the health of subgroups. And that's important for the ethics in public health. On the other hand, this research brings a structural perspective to the LGB health literature, which is often focused on whether or not an individual has experienced discrimination. But I would argue that you need not necessarily personally experience prejudice or discrimination, although that's obviously horrible, but you need not personally experience that to live in a stigmatizing environment and to feel stigmatized based on your sexual orientation or sexual identity. This research uses a validated measure of the alcohol policy environment, which is the alcohol policy scale score, and it accounts for a variety of individual and state level variables to try to rule out confounding and other alternative explanations for the associations that were found. And I would argue that it takes a resiliency approach to health disparity. So, what I looked at was whether or not a state had inclusive non discrimination laws. And I would argue that this takes a resiliency approach because it means that our advocacy, it gives us a place to go with our advocacy in achieving greater equality for LGBT people. And finally, I'd like to end with the policy and practice implications of this research. So there are a lot of folks in this room. This probably comes as no surprise that sexual and gender identity questions need to be standard on every government survey. This is simply demographic information. We all have a sexual orientation, we all have a gender identity, and it's important for us to understand health differences and, in particular, health disparities across these different demographic subgroups, the same way we do for age, race, ethnicity, and income. Alcohol policy research and advocacy, I would argue, does require a health equity perspective. We know that there are disparities in binge drinking and other patterns of hazardous alcohol use across different subgroups. And so we need to look at whether or not the policies that we are advocating for and enacting actually do have the same impact on different subgroups. And if we don't, we need to be figuring out other ways to achieve a reduction in in binge drinking disparities and disparities in hazardous alcohol use. And I also want to argue that non-discrimination state laws, as well as state legislatures, are important places for advocacy and for fighting for health equity and equality. So, for example, most folks have maybe heard about the Bostic v. Clayton County Supreme Court decision that came down in June. So, the Supreme Court held that Title VII, the term sex, actually includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So, it is illegal in this country to fire someone on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. However, there are a variety of laws that still get enacted at the state level. Public accommodations laws, for example, are mostly enacted at the state level. So there is still room to create greater equity by implementing laws at the state level, despite the Supreme Court decision. But I will mention, because a lot of folks already know, that the US House passed the Equality Act back in May of 2019. So the Equality Act, what it would do is it would expand the 1964 Civil Rights Act, as well as the Fair Housing Act, to include sexual orientation and gender identity protections. And there's maybe a chance with the new administration that, that this could be passed. But I would still argue that state legislatures where most laws actually get passed are still places for advocacy work. And it's amazing to me that I've come all the way to the end of this. I have my advisor, Dr. Joanne Cohen, who I remember when we started this journey together, she said, I can walk with you or I can run with you. And I decided to run, and she's been with me every step of the way. I want to thank the members of my dissertation committee, Dr. Renee Johnson, who have provided an enormous amount of feedback to me throughout this process and really helped to strengthen this research. I cannot thank you enough for sort of also being with me every step of the way. I also need to thank Dr. Elizabeth Platts and Dr. Kate Smith for putting me on the National Research Service Award in Cancer Epidemiology and Control. It's been great to be paid to do the work that I love to do and that I feel is important. I have a number of mentors, both inside and outside of Hopkins. You can see your name here. My doctoral cohort. You can see all the people who kept me sane through this process, and to my family, whether you're watching from afar or watching from above, I know that you're with me. And I'm going to try to get through this part without getting very emotional, but I have to give a huge shout out and thanks to my mother, who often believes in me when I don't believe in myself. And I just am going to tell her, Mommy, you're always right. So thank you for bringing me into this world and really supporting me through everything that, that I've wanted to do. And with that, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. I should just say, if you have any questions that you can't get to today, this is my contact information, but I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and open it up for any questions that you may have.
It's fantastic, Naomi. Thanks so much. And Mom is always right. Great. So we have some time for questions. You can put questions in the chat, but maybe just raise your hand so Naomi gets to hear your voice. And any questions? Yes, David.
Thank you, and thanks, Naomi. This is so wonderful and just so exciting. I'm absolutely thrilled that you've been able to do what you've done. It's a marvelous contribution, such important work, and thanks to all the colleagues at Hopkins for supporting her in doing this. I couldn't be more thrilled to see what you've been able to do. So that's the first thing. Then I have 4 questions. And I don't expect you to answer them all, but I'll just throw them out. The first is, you adjusted for Catholics, but not fundamentalists. And religion is such an important issue in LGBT folks' lives. And fundamentalist Christian environments are so often hostile. So I wondered why that was not in the mix. The second, what the heck's going on with the men? If there were no significant associations with the males, I'm curious what your thoughts are there. The third is interesting directions for the future. There's increasing tabulation of the deaths of despair. And I'd be very interested to see what this would look like as an analysis using the deaths of despair as an outcome. And you probably saw the piece that just came out in the BMJ that looked at many, many deaths of despair. So people are doing increasing work in classifying those, and that could be an interesting data set to look at. And then finally, on your implications, it also appears that strong alcohol policy environments are protective of lesbian, gay, of LGB, well, particularly of LB populations. And I would say that an implication would be that the LB movement ought to be supporting stronger alcohol policy environments as a good step for our community.
Thank you, David, for those questions. So I'll start with the first one. Why didn't I include fundamentalists? You can hear me, right? I just saw a message that I was, okay, great. So I think this is actually something I need to dig more into. I did pick this variable based on previous work that had been published in the literature. And I think the data set from which this comes from, it seems like being able to get an accurate count of Catholics seems easier than several of the other Protestant groups, and that may have something to do with the organization of the Catholic religion versus other religious groups. But I think you bring up an excellent point in terms of including that. I will say that and this is some work done by Holt in 2006, that where there was a higher proportion of Catholic adherents, there was the flip side for Protestants. Not that, and so you had a question about what's happening with males. So I think part of this is about the finding of the gender paradox, which is that so there's a couple of different ways to talk about this. So heterosexual men have much higher prevalence of binge drinking and other hazardous drinking compared to heterosexual women. But when we look across sexual identity, we see that flipped in some cases. And in some studies, the differences between heterosexual men and gay bisexual men is actually not there. Within some cases, gay and bisexual, gay men in particular, having lower binge drinking prevalence. And I think that may have something to do with the ways in which social norms around drinking for men and women are very different. So there's already not that much of a difference in the prevalence between heterosexual, gay, and bisexual men. And so the lack of variability there means that we're not necessarily seeing the same strength of the associations. I actually didn't see that piece, so I'll have to go and find it on the deaths of despair. And I'd have to think a little bit more about your question around next steps in looking at the deaths of despair. And I completely agree with your implication around lesbian and bisexual, but also just the LGBT community. I've thought a lot about the way that the alcohol industry markets to the community. There's some interesting things happening with the Lesbian Bar Project. I don't know if folks have heard about that, and it being sponsored by an alcohol company. So I think that that's a really important implication that you've brought up.
Yeah, Laura.
First off, you did phenomenal, but I knew you were going to blow it out of the park. So I'm always still very impressed, even though I always know you're going to blow it out of the park. There's a paper that I wish I could remember who wrote it, but it was back in like 2015 or 2016 that came out about how GSAs, that if there's gay straight alliances in schools, that they find lower binge drinking in students, not just LGBT students, but also straight students, that it sort of lowers that sort of having this more inclusive environment is beneficial for all students, not just LGBT students. And so I was wondering kind of what were your thoughts around like your analysis, and if you felt like, could more inclusive policy environments also be sort of, lowering binge drinking among all adults, or, what are your thoughts? It's kind of a half-baked question, but it's more of a, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think, so one of the choices that I made in this study was to include people across a wide range of age groups. But you could argue that it would be important to just look at emerging adults. So that's maybe slightly different. So emerging adults are 18 to 25. There's an argument to be made for just looking at emerging adults where you see the highest prevalence of binge drinking and seeing whether or not these relationships, I would hypothesize that there probably would be stronger. And then looking at using, for example, YRBSS data to look at the same relationships. There, I think we'd have to think about whether or not something like inclusive employment, housing, and public accommodation laws, whether or not those are functional for that age group, or whether or not they're more symbolic. Whether or not symbolically they create a more inclusive environment. And I'm thinking about some work by Julia Raifman, that looked at marriage equality and suicide attempts among LGB young people in the YRBSS, and found that, she did a differences analysis and found lower suicidal ideation and suicide attempt among LGB students in states that had passed marriage equality versus those that didn't. So I think there's potential for future research being done in that area among, again, emerging adults, and then also among younger people as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other? Yeah, go ahead, Elise.
Hi, Naomi. I thought you did an excellent job. It was a really, really interesting presentation. My question for you was in terms of the inclusive laws. You mentioned 3 types of laws, whether I think it was housing, public accommodation, and something else. If a state was inclusive in one area, but not all 3, how did you code that? And did you see any differences based on which of the areas they were inclusive in or non-inclusive in versus if you looked into that?
Yeah, so for the 35 states that were included in the analysis, for the time period that I'm looking at from 2015 to 2018, if it was inclusive in one area, it was also inclusive in these other 2 areas. Now, I think where I think there's an important thing to think about is there are states where people might be protected under in other ways, like, for example, executive orders. Those states would get a 0. Or, for example, I'm thinking of Kansas in particular, that doesn't have inclusive state laws, but at the local level, you might be protected within a particular city. So some people in the state might be protected and some people might not be protected. And that isn't included in these analysis, but I think it'd be really interesting. I've got a lot of future study ideas. I think it'd be really interesting to look at those differences within states.
Super. I think we have time for one more question. Of course, Naomi's going to get lots more questions after this, but one more question from this group. Jennifer.
Thanks so much. This is such interesting research, and your presentation was so fantastic and clear. I really learned a lot and appreciated it. So Naomi, thank you so much for that. My question or thought is, mentioning the Dyke Bar projects and understanding sort of the important role that community gathering spaces have had for queer women over time. And we know that queer bars, especially queer bars for women, have been closing across the country. It was a pretty big deal when DC just opened up the bar last year, I think it was. So I guess I'm just curious of your thoughts, given that, alcohol abuse and use and binge drinking is a problem, a public health problem, and you sold me on that. But also given that, social connection is a good thing, and that happens around alcohol for a few different reasons, how to sort of balance those things and thinking about future steps for program and policy. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And it's something I have thought a lot about. I remember living in New York City and one of my favorite bars closed. And so, yeah, they are really important spaces. The thing that I keep thinking about is that connection is what's important. And I would say that we deserve more than just spaces where alcohol use is the primary behavior in places that we consider to be safe. So I think it's still important for us to create connection in the community. And I think we can do that in other ways that aren't also places where these types of where hazardous alcohol use can happen. So for example, I think about, again, I used to live in New York City. I think about the center down in Chelsea, as a gathering place. I think of, I've heard stories of people creating coffee shops to create places for connection, for community. Again, I think I want to just emphasize that we deserve to have safe spaces that are not just these particular spaces. And I think it's going to be about changing our thinking process around where we can find connection. So I don't want to pick on the Lesbian Bar Project. I just think that it's important for us to think about other ways that we can create connection and community.
That's great. I think that's a great way to end this part. Thank you all so much for joining and for all your support of Naomi. We're gonna save the comments so we have them, and really appreciate you joining in today. And Naomi, congratulations on doing such a great job. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Okay, I'm just saving. Naomi, do you want to save the chat too, just in case oh boy, why is this?
Yeah.
I'm having problems now. So Sarah, I think we're good.
All right.
Thanks so much.
I saved all my questions just in case, but you did a wonderful job. Congratulations. Really just.